Okay, welcome to our class tonight. They start jumping out on the desk. We're looking at Paul's letter to the Galatian churches, as we have been for 86 other classes, and we're coming down, whittling it down to the end of the letter, and so I want to begin here I'm going to read verse 11 through 13. That's probably as far as we can go, and we'll kind of recap in verses 9 and 10 from our last class. Galatians 6:11. You see how large a letter I have written unto you with mine own hand. As many as desire to make a fair show in the flesh, they constrain you to be circumcised, only lest they should suffer persecution for the cross of Christ. For neither they themselves who are circumcised keep the law, but they desire to have you circumcised, that they may glory in your flesh. This is what is often called the conclusion of the letter, or Paul's benediction of the letter. So he's kind of summarizing some of the things, the major points of his letter, the things that he does want them to remember, his major thrust and meaning. So these are very important verses, not saying that the rest wasn't, but these are in absolute connection to the whole letter as a summarizing statement to his point in the letter. And we may not, I think verses 14, 15, really all of them, but we'll lead up to that tonight in these three verses. But in our previous class, we were talking about verses 9 and 10 specifically, or at least the majority of the time. And let me just read those two. Let us not be weary in well-doing, for in due season we shall reap if we faint not. As we have therefore opportunity, let us do good unto all men, especially them who are of the household of faith. And again, not to belabor the point or go over it extensively again, but Paul is not talking about getting frustrated or tired in doing good deeds or doing good things. He's talking about getting weary in their pursuing of that which is good. Well-doing, if you'll look it up in the Greek, it is actually that which is good, the thing which is good. Or in a pursuing or a journeying into that which is good. And he's saying in this journey, in this continuing on, in this divine journey that is orchestrated by the Spirit of God, do not become weary in such a thing. Because in due season, we will reap. What is that? The heart turned to see the Lord, and when the heart turns, he shall appear. That's the due season of reaping. It's not about getting good things from God because you did good things to men. It's about your soul pursuing and setting your affection on that which is good, that which is perfect, that which is above. And in the seeing, in the time of the appearing, at the set time of his appearing in your soul, you reap the bounty in the comprehension of his presence. You reap the bounty of his divine riches and substance and fullness. And in that, if we faint not, that is the case. If we do not lessen or to divert our heart from our pursuing of that which is spirit, that which is perfect, that which is truth in due season, a heart that is oriented and gazing in that direction will behold the Lord, and there's no doubt about it. He shall appear to those who look for him. And he shall appear without sin, which means he appears without reference to me. he appears as a salvation having no reference to that which falls short of him. He appears as our full salvation, as our perfect salvation. And the soul then reaps the benefits and the bounty of such a glorious salvation, a great salvation. And then in verse 10 it goes on and proceeds from that point. So he goes on and says, as we therefore have opportunity, and the word opportunity there is the same word in the Greek as the word due season. Which means as we are experiencing that due season of the revealing of the Son and beholding his face as the substance of all spiritual things, then and only then can we do good unto all men, especially the household of faith. What does that mean? I have nothing to give you. I have nothing good to offer you. I have nothing, and because the word there, do, in the Greek would be better translated as minister. Minister good. Minister the good. What? The good that was to come, as Paul says. The good thing that he could not do in himself in trying to adhere to the law. He's saying, as the opportunity is there, as the season of his revealing unfolds in your soul, then you can minister that good thing to all men, especially, chiefly, to the household of God. What does that mean? Then you live in the light. I wrote here, then we can minister good, declare and live daily in the midst of all men, in the midst of his church, in the light of the life that is being revealed. In the light of the life that we presently possess. Because until that life is being revealed in due time, in the due season of his increase in my soul, and my soul beholding the fruit that is Christ, not the fruit that I think's back here that Paul says is works of the flesh, not fruit. But when I see the true fruit in due time, then I can live in that reality and minister out from that reality to his household and to all men. I live before every creature on this planet in the good of salvation, in the light of life. I have something good to declare. I have something good to minister to his house. That's why Paul said he's revealed his Son in me so that I might preach him. You have nothing to say, nothing to give, nothing in your hand, nothing in your heart to declare until he is seen. And that is why Paul is continually in this chapter stressing the importance of a continued pursuing of that which is perfect, of that which is good, of that which is above. So then, he begins his conclusion here. And what we have to keep before us is Paul's desire, because he's about to really contrast his desire toward them with the desire of the Judaizers toward them, why they are affectionate toward them. He says it earlier in the letter, why they covet them, why they're going after them and pursuing them. Well, there's a reason Paul's pursuing them. He says the reason he's pursuing and laboring and travailing is till Christ be formed in them. So that the forming of the substance in their soul would cause them and allow them to finally put away the form. Do you see what the difference there? Instead of holding on to a form, to allow the substance to be formed in your soul, which supersedes the form, supersedes the externals. So then your soul is no longer desiring the form because the soul is experiencing the substance those forms testified of. That's Paul's heart toward them. That they would be no longer bound to the externalities of a testimony, but be experiencing the liberty of living by the life of the one the testimony pointed to. Now he contrasts that now and earlier, but now with the Judaizers. But he begins with this verse, and we won't stay long on this, but this is almost a verse that really has no theological meaning to it, yet it's been one of the most debated verses in this letter. And he says this, you see how large a letter I've written unto you in my own hand. That's verse 11. And there's been debate forever. Every commentary has different ideas. Every theologian has different conclusions, and they're all either, okay, he wrote in large letters to them, and both say this was Paul because he usually had someone write the letter while he dictated the letter to them. And some say, well, that's him saying, okay, I'm about to write this conclusion in my own hand in very large letters so you'll know that I wrote it. And most would say, and then you get into different forms of Greek writing, the professional forms, the scholarly forms, and then the regular Greek people's forms of writing. And God, it's just, see, he didn't, we won't even get into that, but that's a debate that's I don't understand the debate. To me, it seems very cut and dry. Paul is saying, I wrote this entire letter to you in my own hand. And most people say, well, he wrote in large letters because, because they think he's talking about each individual letter was big. Bigger than normal. And they say he wrote that because he had eye problems. He wrote big letters because he had eye problems. No, Paul's talking about the length of the whole letter he wrote in his own hand because he didn't dictate this to a secretary. He wrote this in his own hand. Why would he even bring that up? What's the point? The point is he wants to show them his concern for their spiritual understanding, for their spiritual growth, for them. He wants to show them, I didn't put this off on someone to write it. I wrote this in my own hand to you. And I wrote this lengthy letter to you because I am fully and truly concerned with your state. I want you to grow and not be diverted by these Judaizers to settle for something less than Christ, less than reality. And to me, that's the point. That's why he interjects this. It's not so, and I even wrote down here, in the Greek, he uses, to kind of prove this, if anyone wants to debate it with me, but it's not worth debating, but to prove it to some degree, in the Greek he uses this, when he uses the word written here, it's not the word write, it's the word have written. It's in the aorist tense in the Greek, which means it's a past thing, something he's done already. Seeing the letter as something he's already accomplished, he's just concluding it. In Thessalonians, when he talks about the conclusion or the summary he's writing, he uses that in the present tense, which means I've put everything else in this letter I've dictated to someone else, but now this conclusion I'm writing as is my custom. I'm writing this now. So that's as far as I'll go on that. Again, it's not worth debating over, but it's amazing to me. This has been probably one of the most debated verses in this entire letter. So let's go to verse 12. As many as desire to make a fair show in the flesh, they constrain you to be circumcised, only lest they should suffer persecution for the cross of Christ. And Paul, in this verse, he's really exposing the motive behind the Judaizers' affection toward the Galatians, why they're after the Galatians. And when we're going to look at these things, but let's not just push that off on the Judaizers. Let's realize that happens today. This very thing Paul's talking about happens today, because we're going to look at why. The reasons Paul gives is the same reasons that we see today. Proselyting people to your religious bent, to your ideology, to your doctrine. Why do you do that? There's a very good reason. And it's the reason that is hidden in the heart of every man. What is it? To preserve my life. To preserve something I assume that I have. Something I assume I possess. And we'll get to that in a second. But so he is exposing the motives behind them. And the reason they're insisting on external or religious observation from the Galatians. First he says, they desire to make a fair show in the flesh. According to the Weiss commentary, a fair show in the Greek is made up of two words, and which is true according to Strong's. Eu, or however you pronounce that, which means good or well done. Something that is good or well done. And prosopon, which means face, countenance, or presence. So, in the most literal definition, it means to present a good-looking countenance, to present a good-looking face, to make your presence seem good. That's their reason. That's their motive. That's one of the motives. That's what they're after. It's very surface thing. Very aesthetic. Gets no deeper than outward and external appearance. But they want to make a fair show, or they want to present to the Jews and present to the church, whatever, a good-looking countenance, a good-looking face. Or, I wrote here, to demonstrate what is good in their face or their presence. To exhibit in their face what is good. What is good? What is good? There is none good but God. He is the substance of good. The good thing that was to come. Paul says to, I think it's Philemon, the good thing that is in you. The law, a shadow of the good thing to come. Or the good that was to come. So what they're doing is, in the flesh, attempting to exhibit, to evidence, or to give proof of what is good. And they believe that the exercising of flesh or obedience to law or religion is what enables their flesh to exhibit or demonstrate the good. Or demonstrates divine or spiritual reality. And that's what most believe. Many believers. To many believers, this is God's desire. That finally, one day, there would be a moment where my face, my countenance will finally exhibit, or my presence would finally exhibit the characteristics of Christ. That I would exude Jesus to the masses. And that's what they think God's desire is, and that He demonstrates patience until that happens. But the only thing that the Scripture says He has patience toward is waiting on the fruit. What is that? The increase of a seed in us. Waiting patiently for the purpose of the soul, the increase and forming of a seed in that soul. That's the only thing He waits for. That's the only thing He's patient toward. He's not exercising His energies in us, trying to make this flesh or this face or this countenance capable of exhibiting or demonstrating some divine thing. The only divine reality that is ever proven is the divine reality we see in the face of Jesus Christ, not ours. And when you see Christ in such an inward, Spirit-revealed way, you realize there is no proof of spiritual substance outside of His face, outside of His presence, I wrote in my book, Knowing the Satisfied God, that the seeing of Christ, the seeing of his face, needs no further evidence. Needs nothing else to be proven to your soul if your soul has beheld him. But why do we insist on some external, outward show? Because we haven't seen the evidence yet. I'm not saying we don't live in accordance to a spiritual substance and reality that's being revealed in us. That's not what I'm saying. Because your life, your daily living that you're living by the faith of the Son of God will be according to that reality being revealed. There's no doubt about it. But what we attempt to do is put the one before the other, and we attempt to make the other more important. Why? Because the outward demonstration is what we can observe with our natural eye. So we put more credence there because it doesn't demand God revealing his Son. And it keeps me at the center of the thing. It keeps me as the central object of it. And that's part of this that Paul's talking about. This is the ultimate goal, deepest concern of religion. To show the face of man or the person of mankind to be capable of demonstrating or exhibiting eternal spiritual reality. That which is solely and only embodied in the person of Jesus Christ. So when Paul says they're desiring to have a show in the flesh, they're trying to demonstrate who only Christ is in their own countenance. They're trying to be him to the world. To be him to God. To stand before God accepted just like his Son. Now to me, when I say those things, it's just perversion and just the thought of that. But that is the motive of a heart that hasn't seen. It is the heart of Adam. When you address circumcision, which is one of the things Paul addresses here, I wrote, when you address circumcision in the flesh, you see one aspect of the motivation of the Judaizers, to show circumcision in the flesh in the person of mankind as a demonstration of spiritual reality and fulfillment. How are you righteous? I'm circumcised in the flesh. To them, that became the fulfillment of righteousness. That became the fulfillment of something. It became the demonstration of righteousness and holiness. All the while, they have missed spiritual substance. They've missed eternal substance. Meaning they are missing the face or the presence in which reality is truly defined and evidenced. Why? Because they want to see it in their own. They want to see the reality of Christ in their own face instead of beholding his. And beholding in his face the totality of spiritual reality. Why? Because seeing his face is the end of seeing mine. There is a judgment in the seeing of his face. There is self-gratification and edification in seeing mine. I wrote here, when his face is seen, you do not have to attempt to apply spiritual things to yourself in order to evidence it. What does that mean? Because you have already seen or are seeing the one unto whom all spiritual things apply. Even the law itself only applied to one man. It only applied to one life. That's why Paul, when he tried to apply his life to a perfect law that testified of Christ, he says, that's not me. I can't do that. Wretched man I am. Evil is present every time I try to do that good. the good that the law demands. There's an incongruence in the testimony of the law in me, because there's an incongruence in the life of which it testified in me. But the cross brings a cutting asunder between the two. And that's why this whole persecution for the cross, the persecution that they're running from, the Judaizers are fleeing that persecution. Well, not only because they don't want to be beaten like Paul, but because there is in us an innate desire to possess something of spiritual reality independent of Christ. Something that he is not made unto us, but that he has given us as our own possession, or that we have obtained as our own possession through certain good works and labors toward God. But Paul always states, and even in this letter states, that the purpose of the law, the purpose of these outward exercises, were never to give man the ability to evidence in his own face the good thing of which the testimony testified. Circumcision in the flesh was merely a testimony that pointed to the cross, whereby an entire body of flesh, an entire man and creation would be cut off and removed. It testified not only of that objective work, but the inward work, where a man would be cut off from the soul, from the heart, from my view, so that the soul no longer looks upon the face or the presence of that invalid and removed man for anything again. And this is what Paul is addressing in these closing comments. That as long as we are distracted by the fleshly show or the illusions of an external righteousness by law or by religion or effort, we are missing or falling short, coming short of what truly avails. What is that? He'll say, what truly avails is a new creation, wherein Christ is made unto us the fulfillment and truth of the testimony. That's what avails. Not circumcision, not uncircumcision, none of it. Because it's all flesh, it's all earthly, it's all of man. The only thing that avails is him who has no traces, none of the filth of the flesh upon him. So Paul goes on and says, because they desire this show in the flesh, to demonstrate in their own presence and person divine reality, they are constraining you to be circumcised. Now, I'll just stay on that for a second, but see, I put here, I wrote, it gives us a sense of validity. It gives us a sense of validation, and it aids us in our own deception when we can get others involved in it or get others convinced of it, get others to contribute to it. Have you ever heard this? You can have, because this is what the Judaizers were doing, and this is kind of what's in the church today. You can have that spiritual thing, you can have that spiritual experience, but does not the spiritual still need some external demonstration for validation, so it can be valid and seen to be valid? Doesn't that spiritual reality need some external evidence so that it can be validated in its being shown forth to the world? Only to those who haven't seen the true validation, which is Christ himself. Then they need other validation. You need a sign. You need a figure. You need an external type. You need a shadow when you haven't seen the substance. It's so hard for us to understand that the substance, the spiritual substance, is much more real and much more eternally perfect than the externally seen shadows. That's very difficult. It's impossible for the natural mind to understand. I wrote this because of that statement. Still need external demonstration to validate what is spiritual. And I wrote, we are seemingly continually attempting to prove God's realness. Trying to prove how real God is. How do you do that? Because through you. How do you prove how real God is? By showing people. We're continually attempting to prove God's realness, and we seem to want that realness to be demonstrated in or through ourselves. That's what they wanted. They're holding on to a shadow. They're holding on to an external thing that is now in absolute contrast to the spiritual reality that's come. Well, we do the same. We just don't hold on to something that used to be valid. We make up something that never was valid in the absence of seeing the valid substance himself. That's what it's all about. Why do you have this? Because there's an absence of seeing Christ. It's not because there's so much false teaching. That's true, there is a false teaching. But where does that stem from? The absence of seeing Christ. Where does every false step and every false ideology proceeding out of the heart of man, where does it come? What is the basis? Why is it there? The absence of seeing Christ. So then what is the need? A better teacher? A more profound, prolific writer that can write the truth in perfect grammar? No, it has to do with the necessity of your eyes of your heart being open to see him. And then you'll never try to find in the flesh what is only found in his face again. You'll never do it. And that's what Paul's after. And that's why he's warning these people of the motives of these brethren. Because they still have a self-centered motive. And that is, they want to keep something they believe they possess. They want to hold on to a life they believe they have. And that is, not only they have it, but that life is fortified before God because of a religion they adhere to. So Paul goes on and he says, this is the only reason they do this. Listen to these, and we're going to get into this, because to me, I begin to see this open in a way I never had before. They constrain you to be circumcised only. This is the only reason. This is why they want you to be circumcised in your flesh. Lest they should suffer persecution for the cross of Christ. They only want you to be circumcised so they won't be persecuted. But not just persecuted, but persecuted for the cross of Christ. That's a big thing. That's a very important statement. And I'm going to get into that statement, and I want you to just think with me about it, because to me it says everything. It sums this whole, especially the 4th, 5th chapter, it sums it up. Really the whole letter. It doesn't just, I wrote here, it doesn't just mean what you think by reading it on the surface. They do not want to be persecuted by the Jews, so they still hold to the validity of outward laws and external rights and their racial superiority because they're Jews. That's true, but there's a meaning here that's very important that we need to look at. If we look back at Galatians chapter 5, then we're going to read a few verses here through the next few minutes. Galatians chapter 5, verse 11. And I, brethren, if I yet preach circumcision, why do I yet suffer persecution? Same word. If I preach circumcision and the validity of it, the way they're lying to you and saying I do, then why do I still suffer the persecution from the Jews and the Judaizers? Because, listen to this, for then is the offense of the cross ceased. If I bring something of the old into the new and tout its validity, then the cross is invalidated and I should no longer suffer persecution. But we all know he suffered persecution continually. And I'm not just talking about persecution as being picked on and saying, nah, you believe in Jesus. I'm talking about being beaten, left for dead. This man suffered physically at the hands of these people. And we can tout how wonderful that was, but Paul himself said, that is nothing compared to the glory being revealed in me. Why? Because he saw a reality that was beyond compare. He saw a reality that couldn't touch. That doesn't touch. Being beaten in my flesh doesn't touch the reality I am seeing in Christ. So he doesn't glory in that, but he does realize that he does suffer that persecution. Why then am I persecuted if I preach circumcision? I'm bringing man back into the picture and nullifying the cross. Why then am I persecuted? Same word here as used in Galatians 6 and 12. They do not want to suffer persecution for the cross of Christ. The cross is an offense to man's desire to demonstrate in his own face what is only demonstrated in the person and presence of Christ. The declaring of the cross. The cross cuts between. It is the great dividing asunder of flesh and spirit. It is the great dividing asunder of me and him. Heaven and earth. All of those things. The cross divides. It is a final cut between these things. God finally judging between. And in this, we're going to see the root of that persecution. Why is that persecution there? Are they just beating them because they haven't brought in enough Gentile converts? No, it has nothing to do with that. I mean, they wanted that. Jesus says that. You go out and you try to proselyte them. What is it? You made them twofold the sons of hell or something than you are? And they do that, and they boasted in that. They wanted people to be circumcised to say, hey, now. And even in the Jewish culture, when you become a Jew, when you became a circumcised Jew, you were called born again. If you were a Gentile, you were born again. That's what they call it. That's why when Nicodemus heard the term born again, he says, he immediately took it to himself and says, why do I need to be born of my mother again? I'm already a circumcised Jew. So anyway, the cross cuts between, and there's a persecution that is solely rooted in the offense that the cross brings to man. And we talked about it. Paul says, he talks about the offense of the cross, and it's the word scandal again. And we looked at other types where you have a cutting between or a judgment between Jacob and Esau, Isaac and Ishmael, Abel and Cain, and recently what I've been looking at, Solomon and Adonijah. That's a cutting between, a dividing asunder between two. where one is received, accepted, and the other is removed forever out of God's face, out of his acknowledgement. God no longer relates to or acknowledges his presence. Why? Because there's only one presence he acknowledges. And these men who want to bring their presence or face before God, it's vain. It's vanity. The only face he receives is his Son's face. And that's the face he desires to reveal in our souls, so that our souls would be so captivated and captured and raptured in the seeing of that face that we'll never gaze outside of his face again to look for anything. And I know this is all things you've heard, simple, but it's the same thing. So listen to this. I want to take you to Acts chapter 9, and you should all know what this is. But this should also bring the word persecution into context. It's the same word in the Greek. This is Paul, of course, going to Damascus, or Saul at that time. And as he journeyed, he came near Damascus, and suddenly there shined round about him a light from heaven. And he fell to the earth and heard a voice saying unto him, Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me? Now consider that word. Why persecutest thou me? And he said, Who art thou, Lord? And the Lord said, I am Jesus, whom thou persecutest. It is hard for thee to kick against the pricks. Now, why did I read that? This is the same picture presented in Galatians 6:12. Paul is the guilty party now in this picture, and he is persecuting Christ. Now we know he was after the church, he was after the Lord's body, but he was persecuting Christ. Jesus says, you're persecuting me. Now we won't get into the ins and outs of that, but because I have another point. Because this is the root of persecution. This is the root of the persecution from which the Judaizers were running and which Paul continually experienced. The same persecution that Paul was showing to Christ is the same persecution these Jews will show to Paul, and the same persecution that the Jews would show to these Judaizers if they were to say, Christ is it. There's nothing else. He is it. He is the end of the law. He is the righteousness of God. That brings about a great persecution. What was the root of the persecution and why? Paul was attempting to keep a law and give a show in his own flesh of the substance of which the law spoke. Now, attempting to hold to an external testimony, and by doing so, fighting to possess what only belonged to Jesus Christ. Trying to possess something that belongs solely to Christ. Another ploy by religious flesh to take the inheritance from the only rightful heir. That's what Paul was doing. He can't be the heir. We're the sons of God. It's the same fight he's fighting here in Galatians. The same thing he's talking about. Who's the heir? To whom does the promises belong? To whom does God give this full measure of inheritance? And he doesn't say he takes it from one group of people and give it to another group. He's saying it belongs to the seed. That seed which is Christ. And because he would say that, Paul endured the most awful persecution. The root of the persecution spoken of here and in all of the other places we'll point out is the innate desire of flesh to have something of spiritual life or standing before God aside from and independent from the Son of God. You see, in the darkness of the shadows, flesh can assume that he has found in himself something of divine substance. I'm going to read that again. In the darkness of the shadows, flesh can assume he has found in himself something of divine substance. And Paul continually declared that every shadow was fulfilled, not in flesh, but in the Son who lives in his body. By doing that, what was he doing? He was cutting asunder every expectation of flesh, every hope of religion, every hope of a religious external rites and ceremonies of the law, and saying none of it avails. Only Christ avails. And there's the root of all persecution. The desire in the heart of man to possess what belongs only to Christ. This is, I wrote here, this is why Paul was continually encountering severe persecution. He was declaring Christ as the end, the conclusive object and meaning of the testimony, the substance unto whom the Scripture pointed, cutting asunder the false boasting of flesh by declaring Christ himself as the only righteousness, the only holiness, the only life that is received and acknowledged of God. Declaring an entire new age had come, and that God by the cross had put away an age of external shadows. Can you imagine the hatred that which rises up in the heart of those who had their hopes in being the spiritual sons of God, and hearing God only has one? It's the same hatred that rises up in the heart of us now when we hear that. It's the same thing that rises in the heart of Adam when he hears there's none righteous but Christ. And you can't be made righteous by works or efforts of the flesh. You must live you must have the life of God living in you. It's not about your life coming to finally equate his. It's his life living instead of yours. Or the life living instead of a life you assume you had. To me, this is the pricks or the goads against which Paul was kicking, as well as the Jews and the Judaizers. Remember, Jesus says it's hard for thee to kick against the pricks. He was kicking against the very testimony of the law. See, the goads was that which kind of prodded the ox on into the field, and he'd kick against it trying to push back, and it would just push him and urge him on. He'd wound himself trying to do it. It was just wounding him every time he kicked against it. That was what Paul was doing. That's what the Jews were doing. That's what the Judaizers were doing, really, is they were trying to keep back up, not allow God to bring them on. Do what the very thing Paul said the law was intended to do, which was to bring them on in a forward progress unto Christ. Unto its conclusion, unto its end, the limit pointed to, the destination it pointed to. He was kicking against the very testimony of the law that goaded or urged him unto Christ, that continually pushed him forward toward the completion of its testimony, to the face of the true Son and the true heir. I printed out this part of a commentary from Brother James Fowler. From his website, Christ in You Ministries, and it's he talks about this. It says the cross of Christ. This is why it's persecution for the cross of Christ. We've said it because basically the cross is the dividing between that which is not and that which is Christ. That which is spiritual and that which is earthly or natural. The cross of Christ serves as a denial of all Jewish privilege of race and religion, all efficacy of the old covenant, and all benefit of keeping the law with its ritual requirements and works of performance for righteousness. Such an understanding of the cross was repudiated by the Judaizers as they sought to preserve their racial and religious affinities with the Jewish people, who regarded themselves, listen to that, regarded themselves as especially chosen for superior privileges, believing they had a place or a position with God they didn't. In the particular context of the Judaizers, proselytizing, promulgation of circumcision of Gentile believers in Galatians, the advocacy of the identifying mark of the flesh in male circumcision as a necessary performance of righteousness served as a mitigating factor whereby they could avoid the persecution that would necessarily result from regarding the cross as the sole basis of righteousness and the rejection of all else. In other words, the cross is a denial of your life. And you desire to keep it. You desire, and it's not a life, it's an assumed life. It's an assumed righteousness. You have to understand that. It's an assumed thing. We'll look at that here in a moment, but it's an assumed thing. This should cause us even to go back, and this is what I begin to see, because it answers even in the letter of Galatians. Paul had already spoken about this. Chapter 4 of Galatians, verses 28 through 30. Now we, brethren, as Isaac was, are the children of promise. I wrote this down in the Weymouth translation. I like it. You, brethren, like Isaac, are children born in fulfillment of the promise. Listen to that. Are born in the fulfillment of the promise. Born of the seed who is the fulfillment of the promise. But as then, he that was born after the flesh, or I put here, I still have this in Weymouth, just as at that time, the child born in the common course of nature, by natural strength, persecuted the one whose birth was due to the power of the Spirit, so it is now. Persecuted. Nevertheless, what saith the Scripture? Cast out the bondwoman and her son, for the son of the bondwoman shall not be heir with the son of the free woman. An assumed position, an assumed inheritance, an assumed righteousness. We can live forever within our own illusions and our own assumptions. And we can attempt to do what it takes, what religion gives us as the means to fortify those illusions and make them reality. But all you're doing is missing reality. You're coming short. You're falling for something short of reality. Jamieson, Faustin, Brown says, Sarah saw the son of Hagar mocking. This is in Genesis 21, we'll read in a second. But Ishmael was now aware of the great change in his prospects. The great change that come. When did this happen? This is really important to understand when these things were said and why the persecuting or the mocking of Isaac took place. And Jameson, Fawcett, and Brown is right in saying Ishmael looked at what was taking place and realized, his prospects were looking very dim. The inheritance didn't belong to him as he assumed. Why? Because the true son was now recognized. You see that? Man, persecution is the result. He began to persecute Isaac. Why? Because the true son was revealed. That happens. That happens here. There's something in me that fights against the one whose right it is, who is the true heir, because there's something in man, that innate desire in man to have that himself, to possess that. And so we've created a religion that says he's given you that. That's what the cross was all about. Why does the cross no longer suffer persecution? Because the cross is not the cross anymore as far as the gospel that's preached. The cross is man brought in, man given everything. When the cross is man put away and Christ exalted as the substance of all things. The one to whom the full inheritance belongs and who possesses all riches. But the grace of God to man is the one who is heir, the one in whom all those riches are culminated, dwells in us, and is made unto us the fullness of those riches. And God desires for our soul to come to an ongoing apprehension of the substance and fullness we have received. And yet, we fall short. We want something of our own. We think that's better. Why? Because you haven't seen the better yet. That's the whole Hebrew letter. You want to go back to this and possess these things, external righteousness, because you haven't seen the better yet. Again, the necessity of seeing the better thing, the better one. So Jameson, Fawcett, and Brown, let's read Genesis 21. Unfortunately, I didn't write down. This may be Young's literal or the Green's literal. If Genesis 21:10, it says, she says to Abraham. Now, let me just, the setting here. Isaac is weaned from his mother. He's weaned now. And they throw a feast for Isaac. And out here in the distance is Ishmael. And he is mocking Isaac. And Sarah sees him mocking her son. And that's when she goes to Abraham and says, he must go. Him and his mother must be removed. And here's how it's said here. She said to Abraham, cast out this handmaid and her son, for he hath no possession with my son. Listen to those words. He hath, this is Young's literal, he hath no possession. Not he will not get into possession, or I will take the possession he has away from him. He doesn't have a possession with my son. He never had it. He assumed he had it. He assumed it an inheritance that belonged to him. But he hath no possession with my son. That's important. It's not a possession stripped from him. It's a possession that he never had but believed he did. That's us. That's religion. That's what it does. It lives on an assumed place, an assumed relationship, an assumed righteousness. When this was understood, persecution came. Persecution. Jameson, Fawcett, and Brown goes into this weaning of Isaac and shows why it was so significant and why Ishmael started persecuting and why this happened. And it's the same in Genesis or Galatians of why they will persecute Paul, why they will persecute the Judaizers if they preach the cross as it truly is. Listen to this. In Eastern countries, this is always a season of domestic festivity, and the newly weaned child is formally brought into the presence of the assembled relatives and friends to partake of simple viands. Isaac would have been attired in symbolic robes, which is the badge of his birthright. He was then admitted or shown to be the heir of the tribe. That's why it was significant. And that's why Ishmael began to mock him, because now the true heir, the true son, the true seed, unto whom all that belonged, was revealed. And that's why Paul suffered the persecution he suffered and didn't run from it, because he declared the true heir unto whom every promise was made. He declared the true and rightful son of the Father's love. And he, by doing so, declaring the cross, because that's what it is, cut asunder the hope of every assumption of every man who desired that place, that standing, that position. Understand? That's what we want. We want a standing separate. But Paul always declared in the cutting away of everything but Christ, the Son to whom all things belong, the heir to whom the inheritance belongs. He never left us out. He says, but God has caused that Son, that heir, to live in us, crying, Abba, Father. And now we are known of God in that Son. He always presents the grace of God out of the wrath of God upon everything that is not the Son. This is the reason Paul was persecuted. I've already said that. Listen how Paul describes the same type of people, the ones that would persecute, and this is in Philippians 3. And this is after he said everything he said. You have to understand, Paul was a man at one time persecuted the Lord, persecuted the church because of the same reason. He wanted, by religious zeal, effort, and observance, to take unto himself and possess what Christ was, possess what belonged only to Jesus Christ. And that's why he was so furious at the church, because of the prospect it offered. What? You mean the law is invalid? That means my righteousness is invalid. That means my life before God is invalid. Do you understand? That's the source of the persecution he brought to the church. But then he saw the Son, he saw the heir, he saw the seed. And I'm telling you, when you see the seed, there's a judgment. There's a true judgment. Paul saw this one. He saw the Isaac, the true heavenly Isaac. And now he desired, in Philippians 3 we read, he desired only to be found in him, not possessing anything himself. That's totally different than what the Judaizers of the Jews or Ishmael desired. They wanted the possession. He wanted Christ as his possession, to be found in him, not possessing anything of my own. And then he goes on and he talks about these who are totally contrary to such an understanding. After he talks about pressing toward the mark and all of that, he says, brethren, be followers together of me, and mark them which walk so as you have us for an example. For many walk, of whom I told you often, and now tell you weeping, they are enemies of the cross of Christ, whose end is destruction. Now listen to these words. The end is destruction. That doesn't mean they're going to die, drop dead. That doesn't mean their finances are going to collapse. That doesn't mean any of that. Their end is destruction. The word end there is teleos, which Jesus says, I'm the end. But they have their own end. They have their own destination in view. And what is it? To possess what belongs to Christ. And their end ends in destruction. What's destruction? Loss, ruin. Why? Because you have lost the reality. You have fallen short and come short, and now the end that you desired, the end that you believe you've possessed, because Paul thought he had reached the end, blameless, touching the righteousness of the law, all of the things he said. He believed he had attained to something. All the time fighting that inward thing of Romans 7, but believed he had attained to something. And he saw the Lord and said, it's all dung, it's nothing, and to hold on to this as my end would be loss. But now I suffer it, loss, so that I may win Christ. You see the difference in that? So this is the reason Paul was persecuted. He was a man who had seen and declared the substance of Christ and not the efficacy of flesh. He stripped man of any assumed place or any assumed possession. He declared Christ as the only seed and substance. He stripped Ishmael of his assumed place, his assumed possession, in his declaration of Isaac, the seed of promise, the one in whom all the promises of God, yes and amen. He declared Christ as the righteousness of the law, as the one offering that was accepted, as the true and final feast day, and as the Sabbath day of God. And those who wanted to hold on to that because it preserved them, that's what I wrote here. Understand, this is not merely concerning Jews wanting to keep a religion. It has to do with the desire of flesh to hold to some piece or some part of the testimony in order to preserve or save his own life, or what he believes to be a life. The concern, Paul says, their concern for you, brethren, is not for you to know the life you have in truth, but to save theirs. Understand, that's... Again, this is not merely Jews holding on to religion. It's flesh desiring to hold to a piece or a part of the testimony in order to save or preserve his own life and therefore validate before God his own face. And Paul's saying, listen, he's going to go on here and says the only thing that is availing, the only thing that is of value, the only thing that is valid, it's not circumcision and it's not uncircumcision. It's not flesh to any degree. It is salvation without sin. It is a new creation defined by, named by, and embodied by the person of Christ in you. That's who he preached. And that is the thing that persecution will always come to. Flesh will always come against that which cuts asunder its hope of a standing before God of its own. But may we rejoice in the fact that our true and secure standing before God is not I, but Christ who liveth. Christ lives in us. And that's what Paul is concluding this letter in reinforcing, as he said throughout the letter. All right, I'm beyond my time, so I'll stop. And we'll get into the next verses in our next class. Appreciate you being with us. Those of you who are, thank you very much. Just wanted to say, Richard and Judy Mixon, I wanted to just tell them how much I love them and are thinking about them. They which my wife did as well, and Marcia, her mother, and the others of the family just lost someone really close and dear to them, and the last 2 or 3 days. And so I just want to know I'm praying for them. I've been on the phone with them, but you have mixed emotions wanting to be there with them in the flesh, but I want them to know I love them and that we all love them from here, and that's all I'll say there. But appreciate everyone being with us. Thank you. Amen.